Hey fam, good to see you back. Before we dive into today's mystery, Sherlock Holmes and the phantom light of Wren's Wharf, I want to know, what's something that made you smile today? And where in the world are you listening from? I'll be sharing a few of your shout-outs next time, so don't be shy. All right, get comfy, maybe grab a cup of tea. Let's get into it. Because around here, things are never quite what they seem. Chapter 1. The Light That Shouldn't Be There. It was on a chill October evening, one steeped in the thick, damp fog peculiar to London's wharfside districts, that the singular case of the phantom light of Wren's Wharf first came to our attention. I recall the atmosphere vividly, for there was a certain dread in the air, a kind of grim expectancy that clung to Baker Street as persistently as the smoke rising from the chimneys beyond. Holmes had been peculiarly restless that week, the papers offering him nothing more engaging than a minor forgery in Clerkenwell and the predictable collapse of a stock scheme in Shoreditch. He had taken to playing his violin at the most infernal hours, and had twice resorted to monographs on ancient Egyptian poisons, an unwholesome occupation that always signalled a need for fresh stimulation. I was seated by the fire, perusing an account of the recent parliamentary debates when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. The door opened to admit a small, pale man of fastidious dress and a nervous air, who introduced himself as Mr. Cyril Mortlake, a civil engineer contracted by the city for dock renovations near the old Wren's Wharf. "I apologize for the hour, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself stiffly on the edge of the chair Holmes gestured toward. "But I was assured by Inspector Lestrade that no one else in London could make sense of what I've encountered." Holmes, whose long limbs had been arranged in an attitude of nearly boneless repose upon the settee, sat up with interest. "Pray continue, Mr. Mortlake. You have piqued my curiosity. What has the river conspired to conceal this time?" Mortlake cleared his throat, his fingers twitching at the brim of his hat. "It is not a matter of concealment, Mr. Holmes. It is of appearance. A light. A very particular light." Watson, as ever keen to catalogue the facts from the outset, leaned forward. "You refer to a lamp or signal of some kind?" "Yes, a singular one. Wren's Wharf, as you may know, was shuttered after the fire of '89 and has remained unused. Dangerously unstable, in fact. The city plans to have it demolished come spring, and I've been overseeing preliminary surveys. The area is cordoned off and access restricted, yet for 3 nights now, at precisely 1 o'clock in the morning, a solitary greenish light has been seen from across the river, glowing from the second-story window of the old customs office. It burns no longer than 10 minutes, and then vanishes." Holmes interlaced his fingers beneath his chin. "3 nights, you say, and always in the same window?" "Yes, sir." "No other movement or signs of occupation?" "None. The place is sealed, rusted chains on the gates, and the only keys are in the city's possession." Holmes was silent a moment, then stood and crossed to the map of London upon the wall. With a bony finger, he traced the curve of the Thames, pausing at the familiar shape of Wren's Wharf. "Do you suppose," he said at length, "that someone is attempting to convey a signal, or perhaps lure the curious?" Mortlake's eyes widened. "That is precisely my fear. You see, sir, the old office, well, it's dangerous. The floorboards are rotted through in places. One misstep, and a man could fall straight through to the riverbed. If some fool is venturing inside, he risks his life. But, and here is the matter that drove me here tonight. I examined the interior at daybreak, after the first light was seen. There were no footprints, not one, not on the dust-covered floor, nor on the warped stair. Holmes turned slowly, the gleam in his eye unmistakable. Interesting, very interesting indeed. A ghostly light in a sealed building, no evidence of entry, and a dangerous drop awaiting the curious. Dr. Watson, what say you to a visit to the banks of the Thames tomorrow evening? I smiled despite myself. The hound had caught the scent. I shall have a boat arranged for you, Mortlake offered. One of the survey craft, discreet and quiet. Holmes nodded. Excellent. Bring no one else, and see that no workmen are near the wharf tonight or tomorrow. The fewer eyes, the better. Mortlake rose, a mixture of relief and unease upon his face. You believe it is a trick, then? Holmes gave a thin smile. And I believe, Mr. Mortlake, that when the improbable appears in the garb of the supernatural, it is rarely without an all-too-human motive behind the curtain. And I propose we pull that curtain aside. When Mortlake had departed, Holmes returned to his seat and reached for his pipe. A green light in an abandoned building, he murmured. No footprints, a decayed floor. Tell me, Watson, what does that suggest to you? Only that thing seems impossible, I confessed. Holmes chuckled. Excellent. Then we are off to a promising start. And with that, the phantom light of Wren's Wharf had taken hold of Sherlock Holmes's imagination, and we were soon to discover that its glow concealed far more than flickering gaslight. Chapter 2. Shadows by the River. The following evening found us aboard a narrow city survey boat, its engine silenced, drifting quietly along the inky waters of the Thames. A pale moon hung low behind a gauze of drifting cloud, its reflection shivering upon the river's surface. We kept to the southern bank at first, moving with the tide until Wren's Wharf loomed into view, a derelict structure squatting along the water like some forgotten relic of commerce, its weather-beaten timbers mottled with lichen and soot. Holmes stood at the bow, his coat collar turned high against the wind, a pair of opera glasses pressed to his eyes. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, save for a cryptic murmur or two concerning architectural eccentricities and ideal vantage points. Do you observe something of note? I asked, shifting in the chill. He did not look away. The customs office window, second story. You see how it's partially boarded, save for the upper panes. That offers just enough room for a lantern, to be raised without the source being visible to the observer. A neat trick, if one wishes to suggest a ghostly presence without betraying the mechanics. But the question remains, how is the light being placed there, if no one has entered? Precisely. He lowered the glasses, which is why I find the window's placement significant. It directly faces the river. One could, in theory, approach by boat, avoiding the unstable interior entirely. I followed his gaze. The wharf had a skeletal look, with mooring posts half submerged in the tide, and a rotting wooden staircase leading from the waterline to the loading platform above. Beyond it, the brick frame of the old customs building jutted upward, its boarded windows like blind eyes. Our boatman, a taciturn fellow named Briggs, nosed the vessel into the shadows beneath a crumbling archway. The water lapped against the hull with a soft, persistent rhythm. Holmes motioned for silence. 1 o'clock is near, he whispered, consulting his watch. Let us see if our phantom keeps its appointments. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The fog thickened around us, muffling the distant clatter of carriage wheels and the clang of bells upriver. Somewhere to the east, a barge horn groaned like a wounded beast. And then, without warning, it appeared. A flicker, greenish, cold, danced in the upper window of the customs house. It glowed for several seconds, then dimmed, only to reappear, more steadily, casting a spectral wash upon the cracked glass panes. There it is, I breathed. Good heavens, just as Mortlake described. Holmes did not reply. He had already begun scribbling in his pocket notebook, his eyes darting from the window to the wharf's edges, then down to the swirling water beside our hull. He examined the brickwork, the river's current, even the dark understructure of the wharf itself, now revealed in the moonlight through a gap in the fog. There, he said softly, pointing. I followed his finger and saw it, barely discernible, a taut length of cord running from beneath the wharf up toward the customs office window. It was nearly invisible against the brick, strung tight at an angle that suggested it had been drawn recently. A pulley line, he murmured, anchored below, rising to that window. Clever! The light itself need never be carried by hand. But surely that still implies someone must be beneath the wharf, managing it, I asked. Indeed, and if so, they are either hiding there, now, or have already slipped away. Before I could reply, a faint splash sounded nearby, soft but deliberate. Holmes stiffened. Briggs, keep the boat steady, he hissed. Watson, follow. Without further explanation, Holmes clambered from the boat and onto the narrow beam that formed the base of the wharf's understructure. It groaned beneath his weight, but he moved with surprising speed for one so lean of build. I hesitated only a moment before following, boots slipping slightly on the slick timber. Below us, the Thames gurgled black and cold. Holmes crouched, examining a metal bracket driven into the stone, to which the cord was tied. It's damp, but not mist, he muttered. Recently. And this, he tugged gently at the cord, which pulled taut, and we both looked up as the green glow above flickered out instantly. Holmes turned to me with a gleam of satisfaction. There's your ghost, Watson. Not a spirit, but a signal. We returned to the boat in silence, the cold seeping into our gloves and collars. Once seated again, Holmes lit his pipe and stared back at the now darkened window. This is no childish prank, he said. It required planning, access, and knowledge of the tides. And a reason, I added. Why go to such lengths to stage a light no one was meant to follow? Holmes exhaled a long plume of smoke. But someone was meant to follow it. Or perhaps someone has already done so. You recall Mortlake's warning. If one climbs those stairs, the floor will not hold. My stomach turned at the implication. You think someone was lured there to fall, I think, Holmes replied, his tone darkening. That we have stumbled upon a trap, and now we must discover for whom it was laid. We said no more on. The journey back, the phantom light extinguished for the night. But in Holmes's expression, I saw that the game had begun in earnest, and that the shadowy reach of Wren's Wharf held more than one secret. Chapter 3. A name in the waterlogged ledger. It was not yet 10 the following morning, when Holmes strode into our sitting room with a damp object wrapped in a square of oilcloth. He had left early, without so much as a word to me, and judging by the river scent clinging to his coat and the faint green smear along his glove, I surmised he had returned to Wren's Wharf on his own. He unwrapped the bundle with the air of a conjurer, revealing the final trick in his act. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, its corners swollen and pages warped by water exposure. The ink had bled in places, but many of the entries remained legible. "You have been diving, Holmes?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Wading," he corrected, shaking out the oilcloth. I recalled that the floor beneath the customs office once served as a record room. Mortlake's reports neglected to mention that the old city manifests were never recovered after the fire. The fire, Watson, as I suspected, did not reach the basement. He settled into his armchair and turned to a bookmarked page, his long finger tracing a half-faded line of scrawled copperplate. "Here, read that entry aloud." I leaned over. 12 March, 1888. Barge Catherine A. Registry number 42917. Arrived from Rotterdam. Freight listed, linen bolts, brass clockwork, sealed crate, not opened. Declared to Inspector Ralston. Crate removed by private courier, on behalf of the Orford estate. I frowned. The Orford estate? That name is familiar. Holmes smiled faintly. As it should be. Lord Edward Orford died under mysterious circumstances 6 months after that entry. Found drowned in the ornamental lake on his property in Sussex. The inquest recorded it as a suicide, citing melancholia. I stared at him. "You believe it was connected to this crate?" "Let us say I find it curious that a sealed consignment, unexamined by customs and noted in a ledger that was supposedly destroyed, was delivered directly to a man who later met a suspicious end." He closed the book with a decisive thump. "This phantom light, Watson, was no mere trick to amuse superstitious dockhands. It was a signal, intended perhaps to resurrect an old transaction best forgotten." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson appeared, bearing a telegram on a small silver tray. Holmes took it with a nod and opened it swiftly. His eyes narrowed as he read. "From Lestrade," he said. "He's requested our presence at the Southwark mortuary. A body was pulled from the Thames early this morning. Man of middle years. Cause of death undetermined, but with injuries consistent with a fall from height." My pulse quickened. "You think he may have fallen through the customs office floor?" Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Either that or he was meant to appear as though he had. Come, Watson. The dead may not speak, but their silence can be most eloquent." We reached the mortuary within the hour. Inspector Lestrade greeted us with his usual brisk irritation, a file tucked under his arm, and the faintest scent of pipe smoke lingering on his coat. "I'll say this, Mr. Holmes, if this is one of your cursed coincidences, I'll be mightily displeased." "I never rely on coincidence, Lestrade," Holmes replied coolly. "Only the patterns that lie beneath it. May we?" Lestrade led us into the viewing room, where a sheeted figure rested on the iron table. He pulled back the linen with a snap. The sheer man beneath had a lean face, his features drawn tight by death, and his clothing still damp from the river. A bruise marred the temple, and his right wrist bent at an unnatural angle. Holmes examined the body closely, pausing at the fingertips. "Rope, burns," he murmured, "recently. And, yes, oil residue under the nails. Engine grease, not from river detritus. Watson, what do you observe?" I leaned in. No water in the lungs. He was dead before he hit the river. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. Struck on, the head, perhaps garroted, then lowered, or dropped into the water to simulate an accident." Lestrade snorted. "And here I thought he just had the misfortune of being drunk and foolish." Holmes pulled a folded piece of damp paper from the inside breast pocket of the man's coat. The ink had run, but one word remained legible. "Selby." Holmes read aloud. "Do you recognize the name, Lestrade?" Lestrade thumbed through his file. "Actually, yes. Thomas Selby, former clerk in the Inland Revenue Office. Dismissed 2 years ago on charges of document tampering. No conviction." Holmes's face was unreadable. "Then we may be on firmer ground than I thought," turned to me. "A man involved in illicit record handling, found dead by the river beneath a window, emitting a secret signal. And the only name preserved in his pocket is his own. That is not a cry for help. It is a message. Someone wanted us to know he was Selby, but not why he was there." Lestrade scowled. "And what do you intend to do with that?" "Return to Wren's Wharf," Holmes replied. "Tonight. But not by boat this time. We must enter through the front, past the rusted gate, over the rotted floor, and into whatever secret chamber Selby died for." As we left the mortuary, Holmes glanced back once at the body. "One ghost has vanished," he murmured, "but I believe there are still others in that place, waiting to be unmasked." Chapter 4. The door beneath the dustit was well past midnight when Holmes and I stood once more before the corroded iron gate of Wren's Wharf. A grey mist slithered along the cobbles, muffling our footsteps and catching the moonlight in fitful glimmers. The river lapped steadily at the quay behind us, an unceasing murmur like a voice just out of reach. Holmes carried a leather satchel under one arm and wore a thick scarf pulled high over his mouth. He had insisted we arrive on foot, approaching from the inland alleyway through a row of disused warehouses. Our boatman from the previous night had been dismissed, and Holmes had sent no word to Lestrade. "I would rather not have the good inspector tromping about until we understand what we're dealing with," he said as he tested the gate's chain. "It was rusted, yes, but not locked. Merely looped and weighted to appear secure." He removed it with a simple twist. "Someone's been coming and going," I noted. Holmes nodded. The illusion of abandonment, always a telling sign. Inside, the wharf felt more oppressive than by boat. The silence pressed down like a lid. The air smelled of salt and damp timber, and the distant groan of a shifting beam echoed above us like a phantom sigh. We made our way through the narrow corridor of the customs house, our lantern casting elongated shadows on walls stained with soot and river mould. The interior was in shambles, papers scattered, desks overturned, windows boarded or broken. Yet there was something deliberate in the decay, as though it had been carefully curated to discourage scrutiny. Holmes moved quickly, pausing only to inspect the floorboards where the dust remained undisturbed. "This is the path our killer took," he said. "And note the trail here. Someone swept the floor, then tracked across it. See the faint drag lines?" He pointed to subtle, straight scuffs in the filth. "And here, heel marks consistent with heavy boots. Not Selby's shoes, which were office brogues, scuffed but not rigid. You believe Selby came here willingly?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crouched beside the far wall, where a low cabinet had collapsed. He brushed away a thick layer of grime and revealed a seam in the floor, an outline of a trapdoor. "Wren's Wharf was more than just a receiving office," he murmured. "Smugglers once favoured it in the last century. This building likely connects to the older dock tunnels." He used a steel pry bar from his satchel and, with a grunt, levered open the trapdoor. A fetid gust of air escaped, reeking of rot and river brine. Below was a short iron ladder leading into darkness. "Do you propose we descend?" I asked, peering into the gloom. "Of course, though if you prefer to stay above and shout for help, should I not return?" I sighed. "Lead the way." We climbed down into a cramped chamber, barely tall enough to stand upright. Brick walls narrowed inward toward a passage that led under the main structure. Our lantern flickered in the thick, stale air. Holmes paused by a wall lined with wooden crates. He inspected the labels. Faded, some Dutch, some French, some entirely blank. "This is no recent edition," he said, "but it has been used. See here, the dust has been disturbed, handprints along the sides, and this one." He cracked open a crate to reveal bundles of sealed papers, bound in twine and stamped with the crest of the Crown Revenue Office. "Stolen records," I breathed. "Selby's work." "Likely so," Holmes muttered, rifling through them. "Correspondence logs, tax declarations, customs manifests, all sensitive material. Someone had the foresight to preserve them here. Either Selby planned to sell them, or someone else already had." We moved deeper into the tunnel, and the air grew colder. At the end of the passage stood a door, iron-bound and ancient, with a single bolt drawn across it from our side. Holmes slid it back and pushed gently. Beyond was a smaller room, stone-floored and windowless, lit only by our lantern. A desk sat in the centre, covered in dust, save for one clean patch where a square object had rested recently. Holmes approached, crouched, and examined the outline. "A lantern," he said. "Our Phantom's very own, removed recently." Tapped the desktop thoughtfully, then reached into the satchel once more and produced a small vial. "A trace of soot collected from the window ledge last night," he explained, holding it to the light. "And now, look." He scraped his finger across the centre of the desk and compared it to the residue in the vial. "Identical," he said. "The lantern rested here after use, before being removed. Someone has returned, perhaps more than once, to retrieve it. But who?" I asked. "And why continue the charade after Selby's death?" Holmes looked up, his expression sharp. "That, Watson, is the key. Selby's death was not the conclusion. It was the signal that something had gone wrong." Sudden noise above. A creak, faint but distinct, snapped our heads toward the trapdoor. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once. We were plunged into blackness. "Someone is here," he whispered, "and unless I miss my guess, they are not pleased to discover the door unbolted." We stood in silence, breath shallow, as footsteps crept across the floor above us. Holmes's voice was low and calm in the dark. "The game, Watson, is very much afoot." Chapter 5. The Man with the Broken Watch. Chain for several tense moments, neither Holmes nor I moved. The only sounds were the faint moan of wind through broken glass and the slow, deliberate footfalls above us, each creak of an icy echo that reverberated down the passage like the toll of a distant bell. Holmes held me back with a slight pressure on my arm. He had already withdrawn his revolver, the click of its hammer faint but unmistakable in the dark. We stood motionless, waiting as the footsteps paused directly above the trapdoor. A beat of silence, then, with the sudden clatter of something being dropped, or perhaps intentionally thrown, a loud clang rang out, followed by retreating footsteps, quick and uneven, fading towards the front of the building. Holmes reignited our lantern in one swift motion. "Come," he said tersely, and we retraced our steps through the tunnel, past the crates, and up the iron ladder into the main floor of the customs house. The room above was empty, though the smell of tobacco lingered in the air, a sharp, acrid kind Holmes always associated with cheap London pubs. Near the threshold of the main door, something glinted faintly under our lantern light. Holmes knelt and retrieved a broken object, a short length of silver chain with a snapped clasp at one end. "A watch chain," he murmured, examining the links. "Worn thin with use, Victorian style but mass-produced, perhaps a gift from a workplace or fraternity." He turned it over, and this engraving, C.A.L. "You know the initials?" I asked. "I do not," he replied, slipping the chain into his pocket. "But someone at Scotland Yard might, and we shall speak to Lestrade before the day is out." We stepped outside into the damp morning air. Fog still clung to the embankment, veiling the city's outline. The river, sluggish and cold, slid by with the indifference of time itself. Back at Baker Street later that morning, Holmes wrote several notes and sent them by messenger. He refused breakfast and instead paced the sitting-room, occasionally muttering under his breath as he consulted the water-damaged ledger retrieved from the wharf. I sat nearby, nursing my tea, and finally ventured, "You suspect that Selby was merely a cog in a larger machine?" "Not merely a cog," Holmes said, stopping his stride. "Selby was a liability, a man who knew too much and lacked the loyalty, or perhaps the fear, to remain silent. His death was a signal, not a climax, but what of the light? Why continue the ritual if the intended victim is already dead?" Holmes gave me a sharp glance. "Because the light was not meant for Selby. It was a summons, and perhaps someone else was expected to respond." Before I could question further, the bell rang, and a moment later Mrs. Hudson announced Inspector Lestrade. He entered in his usual bustling manner, tossing a damp bowler onto the side table. "I've had half of Southwark up in arms about this case," he grumbled, "and then your note arrives, asking me to look into a dead man's jewellery." Holmes gestured to him in the armchair. "Indulge me, Lestrade. The chain we found was engraved with the initials C.A.L. Does that ring any bell in your files?" Lestrade scowled, then pulled a small notebook from his coat and flipped through a few pages. "Well now, it might. We had a Caleb Ambrose. Lytton dock worker turned night watchman. Used to be on the register over at Morton's foundry. Dismissed last winter after a string of petty thefts. Never charged formally. He's been off the radar since. Does Lytton have any known associates? None I could name offhand. He was a loner, lived above the 3 Anchor Inn in Limehouse. Room was cleared out months ago. Holmes nodded, thoughtful. The 3 Anchor Inn. I know it. Dirty beer, worse music, but the talk flows freely. Lestrade leaned forward. You think Lytton's the man we spooked last night? I think, Holmes said slowly, that he is connected. Whether he lit the phantom lamp or merely came looking for something, he knew what was down there, and knew to fear discovery. Lestrade stood, already reaching for his coat. I'll have a man posted at the 3 Anchor. If he returns, we'll have him. Holmes raised a hand. No, Lestrade, no arrests yet not. Let the man believe no one saw him. Give him the illusion of safety. Lestrade gave a long-suffering sigh. You and your games, Holmes. But fine, you'll have your net. Don't let the fish wriggle away. After he left, Holmes turned to me. We'll visit Limehouse ourselves this evening. Lytton may return, or he may have left a trace. In the meantime, I have another errand for us. Mortlake's office at the Department of Dockworks. I looked up. Mortlake? You think he's involved? Holmes gave a thin smile. I think he told us the truth, but only the portion he wanted us to hear. And with that, he rang for his coat and cane. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, but a darker mist still clouded the mystery at Wren's Wharf. And as we set off into the city's labyrinthine heart, I could not shake the feeling that the true light in the case was not the one flickering in the customs window, but the one Holmes sought to kindle in the shadows of men's secrets. Chapter 6. The Engineer's Second Omission. The offices of the Department of Dockworks occupied a squat stone building nestled between the warehouses of Great Tower Street, its windows grimy with soot and its brass nameplate dulled by years of fog and river wind. It was just after noon when Holmes and I arrived. A thin drizzle had begun to fall, softening the outlines of passing carriages and turning the cobbles into slick patches of black glass. Holmes, ever economical in his movement, gave the bell only the faintest tug, yet within moments the door opened to reveal a clerk with ink-stained fingers and a distracted expression. Mr. Cyril Mortlake, Holmes asked without preamble. The clerk blinked at us. Upstairs, second door on the left. We ascended the creaking staircase, its banister polished by generations of civil servants. At the indicated door, Holmes rapped twice, and Mortlake's voice called, "Enter!" The civil engineer rose from behind a desk, cluttered with blueprints and surveying instruments. He looked paler than when we'd first met him. His eyes ringed with fatigue, and a nervous tick fluttering beneath his left eye. Whether it was guilt, fear, or simple weariness, I could not yet tell. "Mr. Holmes," he said, managing a thin smile. "Dr. Watson, I didn't expect—" "Precisely," Holmes cut in. "You did not expect a return visit. But then again, we did not expect to find a corpse floating in the river this morning." Mortlake's mouth parted slightly. "A corpse?" "A man named Thomas Selby," Holmes continued, his tone polite but firm. "You may recall him. Former revenue clerk. It appears he fell, quite literally, into our case." The engineer sat down slowly, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. No, I had no dealings with Mr. Selby. I only came to you about the light. Yes, the light, Holmes said, which glowed at exactly 1 o'clock from a window, facing the river, despite the building being inaccessible and condemned. You were confident it was unoccupied. I am confident, Mortlake replied, his voice tightening. I have the only key. Holmes reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the short length of silver chain we'd found at the wharf. Then perhaps you'll explain how Mr. Caleb Ambrose Lytton, disgraced watchman and former foundry worker, managed to be inside last night. Mortlake's face went slack. We didn't see him clearly, Holmes said, stepping forward, but he left this behind. A chain engraved with his initials dropped in panic when he discovered the trapdoor had been unbolted, and I begin to wonder, Mr. Mortlake, why a civil engineer would concern himself with phantom lights, unless he feared what they might illuminate. I told you, Mortlake said, his voice rising. I feared someone might get hurt. The floor in that building is treacherous, if anyone was entering. You'd be exposed, Holmes finished calmly, because it was not sealed as tightly as you claimed. Mortlake stood suddenly, knocking over a sheaf of maps. I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Holmes, but I will not be spoken to as though I'm under suspicion. My duties are legitimate, and I will not be bullied. Holmes remained still, letting the outburst subside. Then, in a quieter voice, You once told us the building was locked and watched, that only your office held the keys. Yet someone was able to rig a pulley system through the customs office window without triggering your notice. Was it truly oversight or complicity? Mortlake's gaze dropped. I didn't know, he said at last. Not the full extent, but I did notice strange signs. Tools left behind, marks on the walls, an odd staleness in the air, as if the rooms had been opened more recently than I remembered. And yet, Holmes said, you reported nothing. Mortlake's hand trembled slightly. Because I was warned not to. This, finally, earned Holmes's full attention. Warned by whom? I don't know, he said. There was a note, left on my desk after I questioned the discrepancy in the survey reports. Simply read, you saw nothing, say nothing. Your contract ends in April. Let it end quietly. And you obeyed, I said. Mortlake nodded, shamefaced. I have a wife, Dr. Watson. A child on the way. My position here is modest, but it is stable. I wasn't going to risk it for what might have been nothing more than local smugglers squatting in a ruin. Holmes stared at him for a long moment, then turned to leave. At the threshold, he paused. There is one last detail you failed to mention. Mortlake looked up sharply. The fire, Holmes said. You told us the upper floors were unsafe due to the fire in '89. Yet the official reports list no interior damage, only roof collapse, which means you lied about the building's condition to keep others away. Mortlake's shoulders slumped. I didn't lie, he murmured. I repeated what I was told. Holmes nodded. Indeed, and now you've repeated it to the wrong man. We left him staring at the floor, visibly shaken. Once outside, Holmes drew a breath, the mist dampening his lashes. Fear is a powerful sealant, Watson, he said. It can keep mouths closed longer than any bribe. And where to now? I asked. To Limehouse, he said, before our man Lytton bolts again. I would wager the 3 Anchor Inn holds more truth than Mortlake ever dared face. Chapter 7. A Whisper in Limehouse. Fog, the district of Limehouse, with its crooked lanes and tumble-down buildings, wore a sinister look that evening. A sour mist from the river crept between the narrow alleys, coiling about the gas lamps and reducing their glow to feeble halos. Somewhere nearby, a street violinist scratched out a mournful tune, the sound broken and hollow in the damp air. Holmes led the way along Ratcliffe Highway, his keen eyes darting from shadow to shadow. I followed close behind, one hand in my coat pocket, feeling the comforting weight of the revolver I had thought wise to carry. The Three Anchor Inn squatted at the corner of a dead-end alley, a sagging, grimy place with a row of shuttered windows and a crooked sign swinging on rusted chains. It was the kind of establishment where questions were dangerous and answers cost more than coins. Holmes pushed open the door without hesitation. The interior was a fog of pipe smoke, wet wool and spilled beer. A dozen rough-looking men occupied the battered tables, their muttered conversations dying down for a moment at our entrance before resuming with wary glances. Behind the bar, a heavy-set landlord polished glasses with a dirtier cloth than the glass itself. Holmes approached the bar and ordered 2 ales, sliding a generous shilling across the counter. The landlord grunted and poured without comment. "We're looking for a man," Holmes said, his voice pitched low. "Caleb Lytton. You might know him." The landlord didn't pause in his polishing. "Don't know no Lytton." Holmes smiled faintly. "He used to stay here. Room upstairs, back corner. Left in a hurry a few months ago." Still no reaction, but a slight tightening around the man's mouth told Holmes he had struck true. "May return tonight," Holmes continued, setting another shilling on the bar. "We'd like to have a word with him when he does." The landlord glanced over Holmes's shoulder at the assembled patrons, then back. "You'll not make trouble. Here, we are models of discretion," Holmes assured him smoothly. We took a corner table, backs to the wall, and nursed our ales. Holmes observed the room with lazy-seeming indifference, but I knew every flicker of his gaze registered the smallest details, the subtle nods between men, the hasty concealment of a slip of paper, the lingering glances toward the stairwell at the back. An hour passed. A second ale was consumed slowly. Then, at last, movement. A figure slipped through the door, bringing a fresh gust of river air with him. He was a wiry man in a stained greatcoat, his cap pulled low over his eyes. He paused a heartbeat too long upon entry, scanning the room, then made for the stairs without speaking to anyone. Holmes rose casually, murmuring to me, "That's our man." We followed at a careful distance, ascending the narrow, sagging staircase. At the top, the hall stretched into darkness, punctuated by a few flickering oil lamps. The man turned into a room at the end. Holmes moved swiftly, reaching the door in 3 long strides. He rapped twice, then pushed it open without waiting for a reply. Inside, Caleb Lytton whirled around, a knife flashing in his hand. His eyes were wild, rimmed with desperation. "Stay back!" he hissed. Holmes ignored the threat, stepping into the room with a calmness that made even Lytton hesitate. I moved in behind him, revolver half drawn, but not raised. "You have nothing to fear." from us," Holmes said quietly. "But you have everything to lose by running." Lytton's hand trembled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Holmes tilted his head. "Then why did you flee the customs house last night? Why risk returning to this wretched hole, if not to hide from the men who now hunt you?" At the mention of hunters, something cracked in Lytton's expression, a glimmer of terror too raw to be faked. "They said they'd kill me," he muttered. Holmes nodded encouragingly. "Who, Lytton? Who ordered the signal light to be rigged? Who silenced Selby?" Lytton sank onto the rickety bed, burying his head in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he whispered. "I just watched the place, that's all. Made sure nobody got too close. If someone came snooping, I was to light the lantern. Warn them inside." Holmes knelt before him. "Warn whom?" Lytton shivered. "Don't know real names. They called the leader Redgate. Said he worked the docks for years. Knew every tunnel, every crate that could slip past customs." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "A professional? Smuggler. Dangerous, organized, and with long-standing knowledge of the river's hidden pathways." "What were they hiding at Wren's Wharf?" Holmes asked. Lytton shook his head miserably. "Papers, ledgers, stuff from the tax office, things they could use to blackmail rich men, threaten merchants, sway elections even. They kept it all hidden after the fire, biding their time. But something went wrong. Someone talked. They thought it was Selby, and so they killed him," I said grimly. Lytton nodded. "And they'll kill me too if they find me talking to you." Holmes rose. "Then we must ensure they do not." He turned to me, his expression hard. "Watson, we have a name. Redgate, and soon enough we shall have the rest. But tonight we guard our witness. Tomorrow we bring this conspiracy into the light." Chapter 8. The Man Who Spoke for Redgate. It was just after dawn when Holmes and I sat once more in our sitting room at Baker Street, the light creeping feebly across the city's rooftops. Caleb Lytton, exhausted and broken, dozed fitfully. In the guest bedroom, Mrs. Hudson had reluctantly prepared, after Holmes assured her of his harmlessness. Holmes, for his part, had not slept at all. Instead, he prowled the room like a caged hawk, stopping only to scribble notes, examine old court records and dispatch telegrams to every quarter of London he deemed useful. His pipe had been lit and extinguished at least 4 times during the long hours, the thick reek of tobacco forming an oppressive cloud in the stale morning air. I had finally managed to coax some breakfast onto a tray when Holmes spun toward me, his eyes glittering with an energy that belied his sleeplessness. "We have them, Watson, or very nearly." He tossed a sheaf of notes onto the table between us, names, places, dates, all tied together by a central figure, the man known as Redgate. "His real name is Elias Norton," Holmes said. "A dock foreman by trade, dismissed after the collapse of the Broad Street smuggling trial 3 years ago. Clever fellow. He avoided direct implication, but lost his livelihood nonetheless. Since then, he's been building a new network, smaller, leaner, harder to trace." I leafed through the notes, frowning. "But if Norton is as cautious as you say, how do you intend to catch him?" Holmes smiled thinly. "By introducing a new piece to the board. he explained swiftly. We would spread word, through the usual discreet channels, that Caleb Lytton had decided to leave London for good, that he would be boarding a ship at St. Catherine's Dock that very night. If Norton's men believed Lytton, alive and prepared to escape, they would act to prevent him from talking further. In doing so, they would expose themselves. A trap, I said. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. A trap baited with their own fear. We spent the remainder of the morning preparing. Lestrade, summoned by a curt note, arrived with 2 plainclothes officers and accepted Holmes's plan with only minimal grumbling. If your man doesn't show Holmes, I'll be explaining this mess to my superiors, he warned. If my calculations are wrong, Lestrade, I shall willingly compose the apology myself, Holmes said, clapping him on the shoulder. By evening, we stood hidden among the piles of crates and cargo nets at St. Catherine's Dock, the masts of merchant ships rising, like a forest of bare trees around us. Caleb Lytton, looking suitably nervous, paced the appointed wharf under the watchful eyes of Lestrade's men. The lamps along the quay flickered in the rising mist. All was silent save for the groan of ropes and the slap of water against the ear pilings. Holmes watched, every muscle in his lean frame tense with focus. "Wait for it, Watson," he murmured. "Fear does not shout, it whispers." Minutes passed. Then, from the shadows near a stack of barrels, 2 figures detached themselves. One was broad-shouldered and heavy-set, the other wiry, moving with the restless energy of a cornered rat. They approached Lytton cautiously, glancing around. Holmes gave a slight nod to Lestrade. The trap closed swiftly. In a matter of seconds, the plainclothes men leapt from their hiding places, revolvers drawn. There was a brief scuffle, a few shouted curses, but the 2 men were subdued and handcuffed without serious resistance. Holmes approached them calmly, his expression one of mild curiosity. "You will be Messrs. Goff and Prentice, I presume," he said. "Known associates of Mr. Elias Norton, alias Redgate." The wiry man, Prentice, spat on the ground but said nothing. Goff, the larger of the 2, simply glowered. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You'll find enough on them to tie them to the phantom light at Wren's Wharf. In their pockets, no doubt, keys to hidden rooms, coded messages, perhaps even remnants of the pulley apparatus." Lestrade gave a satisfied grunt. "You're a devil, Holmes." "No, Lestrade," Holmes said with a rare twinkle. "Merely a student of human folly." Lytton sagged in relief when Holmes signalled him forward. The poor fellow looked ready to collapse. Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done well, Mr. Lytton. Scotland Yard will see to your protection. And in the end, you may yet find yourself free of your past." As we made our way back along the misty quay, I ventured, "So, Holmes, this Redgate, this Elias Norton, you believe he'll flee now?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, he will not flee." I stared at him. Then Holmes smiled thinly. "He will come to us." He did not elaborate, but there was something in the way he said it that sent a shiver down my spine. The phantom light had lured us far into darkness. But the true architect of the deception, the man whose cunning had outlasted fires, betrayals, and murder, was yet to step from the fog. And Holmes, with characteristic patience, would be ready when he did. Chapter 9. Redgate's gambit. It was scarcely past noon the following day when Holmes's prediction proved chillingly accurate. We had scarcely finished our luncheon when a sharp rap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson, who had not yet fully forgiven us for sheltering a former dock thief under her roof, answered it with visible reluctance. She returned a moment later, her face a curious mixture of indignation and surprise. "There's a gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Rather rough-looking, if you ask me." Holmes smiled faintly. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson. We have been expecting him." The visitor entered with a confidence that did not match his battered greatcoat or the faint trace of soot at his cuffs. He was a thick-set man, his features weathered and square, with eyes the colour of wet slate, cold, appraising, utterly without illusion. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice roughened by years of shouting over shipyard noise. "Name's Elias Norton. Some call me Redgate." Holmes gestured to a chair. "You honour us, Mr. Norton. Please sit." Norton did not sit. He remained standing in the centre of the room, arms folded, his gaze flickering between Holmes and myself. "I don't like the police sniffing around my business," he said bluntly. Holmes steepled his fingers. Few honest men do. Norton smiled grimly. "Save the sermon, Mr. Holmes. I know what you think you know, but let's not pretend you have proof of anything. The Thames has a long memory, but it forgets quickly." Holmes regarded him with a calm, detached air, as though observing a new species of river predator. "You came here to propose something," Holmes said at last. "You would not risk exposure otherwise." Norton's smile widened, though there was no humour in it. "Trade," he said. "You call off your dogs at Scotland Yard. Tell them it was petty smuggling, nothing worth the court's time. In return, I will give you something more valuable than a few stolen papers." I leaned forward, unable to conceal my disgust. "You think to bargain with a murderer?" Norton ignored me. His eyes never left Holmes. Holmes tapped his fingertips together thoughtfully. "And what treasure, pray, do you believe would tempt me, Mr. Norton?" "The real cargo was hidden at Wren's Wharf," Norton said. "Not the records, not the ledgers. The crate that came off the Catherine A 17 years ago. Sealed, never opened by customs. Delivered straight to a dead man's estate and lost when the fire broke out." I felt a jolt of recognition. The ledger entry, the sealed crate for the Orford estate. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the spark of interest in his eyes. "And you know where it is?" Holmes said. "I do," Norton replied. "And it's worth more than all the bribes and blackmail in London." Holmes rose and crossed to the fireplace, where he stood for a long moment, studying the embers. When he turned back, his face was grave. "You are an intelligent man, Mr. Norton," he said. "You know that if I were to make such a bargain, I would become your accomplice." Norton shrugged. "You'd be none the poorer, nor the wiser." Holmes smiled thinly. "But I would be poorer, Mr. Norton. I would be poorer by the weight of my own conscience. No, I fear your offer, generous though it is, must be declined." For the first time, Norton's calm fractured. A flash of anger lit his eyes. "You think you can touch me?" he growled. "I'm buried too deep. You'll never make anything stick." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "On the contrary, by walking through that door, You have gifted me what I needed most, proof that you still seek to protect something. Hidden at Wren's Wharf, proof of conspiracy. And now, in declining your offer, you have demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Norton's fists clenched, but he did not move. Holmes's voice hardened. Inspector Lestrade and his men wait across the street, Mr. Norton. They have warrants enough to tear apart every dockside shed from here to Greenwich. But your greatest mistake was not trusting the river to hide your sins. It was underestimating the tide. Norton's sneer faded into a cold, calculating stare. Without a word, he turned on his heel and stalked from the room. We heard the scrape of boots on the steps, then the shouts as Lestrade's men converged below. Holmes crossed to the window and watched impassively as Norton struggled, cursed, and was finally bundled into a waiting cab. When the street had fallen silent again, he turned to me, his face thoughtful. "Redgate's gambit failed," he said softly, "but the true puzzle remains." "The crate," I said. "The sealed cargo." Holmes nodded. Whatever lies inside was valuable enough to spark murders, blackmail, and the elaborate dance of the phantom light. It was never about the ledgers. Watson. They were a smokescreen. He strode to the mantel, his voice dropping. "And tomorrow we shall open that crate." I shivered, not from the cold, but from a creeping sense of foreboding. For in Holmes's tone there was an uncommon gravity, and, in the thickening fog beyond the window, I felt the invisible hand of secrets long buried, reaching once more toward the light. Chapter 10. The Crate in the Sunken Cellar. The next morning dawned bleak and colourless, a thin drizzle misting the windows of Baker Street as we prepared ourselves for what Holmes termed the final excavation. Lestrade arrived punctually, his mood far more agreeable than usual, owing to the overnight success of Norton's arrest and the confession wrung from the two dockside accomplices. Yet Holmes, despite these victories, remained unusually sombre as he packed a stout crowbar, lantern, and a pair of oilskin coats into a large satchel. "What troubles you, Holmes?" I asked as we descended the stairs. He glanced at me with that rare introspective air that surfaced only when a case approached its gravest moments. "When a man constructs a labyrinth of lies to conceal a single object," he said quietly, "one must consider not only its value, but its danger." We found Wren's Wharf surrounded by a thin cordon of police by noon. The river slapped hungrily at the pilings, and the customs house stood grey and forbidding under the low sky. Several constables lifted the iron gate at our approach, and Holmes led the way inside with a resolute air. The interior was even more ruinous than during our last visit. Rotted beams sagged overhead, and the boards beneath our boots groaned ominously. We passed the deserted customs desks and returned to the hidden trapdoor behind the collapsed cabinet. Holmes knelt, pried open the hatch with a grunt, and lowered himself down without hesitation. Lestrade followed, then I, lantern in hand, lighting our descent into the stagnant gloom below. The cellar, little more than a bricked cavity beneath the wharf, was thick with mildew and the bitter scent of ancient river mud. Broken crates littered the corners, many already split and sagging with damp. Only one remained intact. A large iron-banded box resting against the far wall, half sunk into the mire. Holmes approached it slowly, his lantern casting long shadows along the slick walls. He ran his fingers along the box's side, tracing the faint outline of a shipping seal, a Dutch emblem and faded lettering. Rotterdam, 1888. "This is it," he murmured. "The crate from Catherine A." Lestrade wiped a hand across his brow. "Let's get it over with." Holmes set to work with the crowbar, and after several minutes of grunting effort, the iron bands gave way with a splintering crack. The lid groaned as it was lifted. We leaned in. Inside the crate lay documents, stacks on stacks of them, wrapped carefully in oilskin and tied with twine. Not gold, not jewels, papers, hundreds, perhaps thousands of pages, yellowed but meticulously preserved. Lestrade gave a snort of disappointment. More blasted papers? I thought we were digging up a fortune. Holmes said nothing. He had already seized one bundle and sliced the twine with a pocket-knife. He unfolded the top sheet carefully, his brows knitting together as he read. "Watson," he said slowly, handing me the page, "tell me what you see." I scanned the document. The language was dense, legalistic, and then it struck me. "They're contracts," I said. "Shipping contracts, titles of ownership, mortgages, bonds, and not ordinary ones," Holmes said. "These are original charters and deeds, belonging to half the shipping firms operating along the Thames. Many of them dated decades ago, before mergers and buyouts obscured the lines of control." Lestrade whistled softly. "Whoever held these could blackmail every major shipping magnate in London." Holmes nodded grimly. "Or manipulate the flow of goods, sabotage rivals, ruin reputations. The crate contained leverage, not treasure." He sorted quickly through the other bundles. Some were in Dutch, some French, but the meaning was clear. Together, they formed a map of the river's true masters, names and companies who would pay handsomely or fearfully to see these documents, destroyed or controlled. "No wonder Norton and his men were killed to keep it hidden," I said. Holmes replaced the documents carefully. The original scheme, I suspect, was to use this leverage quietly, to sway elections, influence trade, build an empire from the shadows. But after the fire at Wren's Wharf, the plan unravelled. The loss of the crate led to panic, betrayal, and murder. Lestrade kicked a loose plank with his boot. "And Redgate, he just wanted to bury it all." "Not bury," Holmes said. "Recover, piece by piece. Rebuild the network in secret. Selby, the ledgers, the phantom light. All steps in a desperate game of concealment and retrieval." Holmes straightened, brushing mud from his coat. "Have this crate removed to Scotland Yard under heavy guard," he instructed Lestrade, and place it somewhere no river or rogue tide can reach again." As Lestrade barked orders to his men, Holmes and I made our way back to the surface. The drizzle had turned to a steady rain, washing the soot from the crumbling walls and turning the streets into gleaming black mirrors. We paused at the threshold of Wren's Wharf, Holmes casting a last glance at the grim facade. "You look troubled," I ventured. He shook his head slowly. "Only thoughtful, Watson. We have won, but only because the river gave up its dead, and the light lured more than it warned." He tucked his hands into his pockets and turned up his collar against the rain. "The true currents of this city, Watson, flow not through its sewers or streets, but through the fears of its men. and those currents run deeper than the Thames itself." And with that, Holmes set off into the mist, his figure soon swallowed by the fog, leaving me to follow, as ever a step behind. Chapter 10. The Crate in the Sunken Cellar. The next morning dawned bleak and colourless, a thin drizzle misting the windows of Baker Street as we prepared ourselves for what Holmes termed the final excavation. Lestrade arrived punctually, his mood far more agreeable than usual, owing to the overnight success of Norton's arrest and the confession wrung from the two dockside accomplices. Yet Holmes, despite these victories, remained unusually sombre as he packed a stout crowbar, lantern, and a pair of oilskin coats into a large satchel. "What troubles you, Holmes?" I asked as we descended the stairs. He glanced at me with that rare introspective air that surfaced only when a case approached its gravest moments. "When a man constructs a labyrinth of lies to conceal a single object," he said quietly, "one must consider not only its value, but its danger." We found Wren's Wharf surrounded by a thin cordon of police by noon. The river slapped hungrily at the pilings, and the customs house stood grey and forbidding under the low sky. Several constables lifted the iron gate at our approach, and Holmes led the way inside with a resolute air. The interior was even more ruinous than during our last visit. Rotted beams sagged overhead, and the boards beneath our boots groaned ominously. We passed the deserted customs desks and returned to the hidden trapdoor behind the collapsed cabinet. Holmes knelt, pried open the hatch with a grunt, and lowered himself down without hesitation. Lestrade followed, then I, lantern in hand, lighting our descent into the stagnant gloom below. The cellar, little more than a bricked cavity beneath the wharf, was thick with mildew and the bitter scent of ancient river mud. Broken crates littered the corners, many already split and sagging with damp. Only one remained intact. A large iron-banded box resting against the far wall, half sunk into the mire. Holmes approached it slowly, his lantern casting long shadows along the slick walls. He ran his fingers along the box's side, tracing the faint outline of a shipping seal, a Dutch emblem and faded lettering, Rotterdam, 1888. "This is it," he murmured, "the crate from Catherine A." Lestrade wiped a hand across his brow. "Let's get it over with." Holmes set to work with the crowbar, and after several minutes of grunting effort, the iron bands gave way with a splintering crack. The lid groaned as it was lifted. We leaned in. Inside the crate lay documents, stacks on stacks of them, wrapped carefully in oilskin and tied with twine. Not gold, not jewels, papers. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of pages, yellowed but meticulously preserved. Lestrade gave a snort of disappointment. More blasted papers? I thought we were digging up a fortune. Holmes said nothing. He had already seized one bundle and sliced the twine with a pocket-knife. He unfolded the top sheet carefully, his brows knitting together as he read. "Watson," he said slowly, handing me the page, "tell me what you see." I scanned the document. The language was dense, legalistic, and then it struck me. "They're contracts," I said. "Shipping contracts, titles of ownership, mortgages, bonds, and not ordinary ones," Holmes said. "These are original charters and deeds, belonging to half the shipping firms operating along the Thames. many of them dated decades ago, before mergers and buyouts obscured the lines of control. Lestrade whistled softly. Whoever held these could blackmail every major shipping magnate in London. Holmes nodded grimly. Or manipulate the flow of goods, sabotage rivals, ruin reputations. The crate contained leverage, not treasure. He sorted quickly through the other bundles. Some were in Dutch, some French, but the meaning was clear. Together, they formed a map of the river's true masters, names and companies who would pay handsomely or fearfully to see these documents, destroyed or controlled. No wonder Norton and his men were killed to keep it hidden, I said. Holmes replaced the documents carefully. The original scheme, I suspect, was to use this leverage quietly, to sway elections, influence trade, build an empire from the shadows. But after the fire at Wren's Wharf, the plan unravelled. The loss of the crate led to panic, betrayal, and murder. Lestrade kicked a loose plank with his boot. And Redgate, he just wanted to bury it all. Not bury, Holmes said. Recover, piece by piece. Rebuild the network in secret. Selby, the ledgers, the phantom light. All steps in a desperate game of concealment and retrieval. Holmes straightened, brushing mud from his coat. Have this crate removed to Scotland Yard under heavy guard, he instructed Lestrade, and place it somewhere no river or rogue tide can reach again. As Lestrade barked orders to his men, Holmes and I made our way back to the surface. The drizzle had turned to a steady rain, washing the soot from the crumbling walls and turning the streets into gleaming black mirrors. We paused at the threshold of Wren's Wharf, Holmes casting a last glance at the grim facade. "You look troubled," I ventured. He shook his head slowly. "Only thoughtful, Watson. We have won, but only because the river gave up its dead, and the light lured more than it warned." He tucked his hands into his pockets and turned up his collar against the rain. "The true currents of this city, Watson, flow not through its sewers or streets, but through the fears of its men, and those currents run deeper than the Thames itself." And with that, Holmes set off into the mist, his figure soon swallowed by the fog, leaving me to follow, as ever a step behind. Chapter 11. Aftermath at Baker Street. It was late in the evening when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, our boots heavy with mud and our spirits weighed down by the long day's labour. Mrs. Hudson, though sympathetic, gave us a disapproving sniff as we entered, no doubt noting the trail of wet footprints we left on her freshly scrubbed floors. Without a word, Holmes collapsed into his chair, tossing his sodden coat over the back of it. He reached for his pipe and, after a few false starts, managed to light it, the smoke rising in languid curls toward the ceiling. I poured us both brandy from the sideboard and set a glass within his reach. For a time, neither of us spoke. The room was filled with the comforting crackle of the fire and the muted sounds of the city beyond the rain-speckled window. At last, Holmes stirred. "You see, Watson," he said, his voice low and reflective, "the phantom light was never intended to terrify. It was intended to protect. A beacon for a hidden world built on forgotten paper and broken promises." I nodded, and yet it killed all the same. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Fear is the most effective warden. It binds men tighter than iron. Those who laid the trap at Wren's Wharf underestimated how quickly fear would turn inward, and that in time even the most loyal hound will bite when cornered. He rose and crossed to the fireplace, gazing into the embers. Selby was expendable. A man with a guilty conscience is of no use to those who trade in secrets. When he faltered, they eliminated him without a second thought. Caleb Lytton would have followed had we not intervened. I leaned back in my chair, the events of the past days swirling through my mind. Norton! What will become of him? Holmes gave a slight shrug. With the evidence retrieved from the crate, Lestrade has enough to pursue charges of conspiracy, blackmail, and accessory to murder. Norton will hang, or, if his silver tongue prevails, rot for the remainder of his days behind bars. Either way, he shall trouble the river no longer. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small bundle of newspapers under her arm. "These just arrived, Mr. Holmes," she said. "I thought you might like to see them." Holmes accepted the papers with a nod and sifted through them. Several bore headlines shouting about the scandal at the docks. "Phantom Light unmasked!" "Blackmail scheme broken by Sherlock Holmes." "Crate of secrets recovered from sunken Wharf." He tossed them aside with a wry smile. "Sepulture always prefers a ghost story to a simple confession of greed," he said. I chuckled. "You must admit, Holmes, it does make a better tale." He regarded me thoughtfully. "Perhaps. But tales, Watson, are dangerous things. Once loosed, they cannot be so easily recalled. Better a dull truth than a gilded lie, however poorly it may sell." He turned back to the fire, the lamplight sharpening the keen lines of his face. "Still," he murmured, almost to himself, "there is a certain poetry in it. The river that gave them life swallowed them at last. Justice carried out, not by the courts or the constables, but by the slow, inexorable pull of time, and by the light they themselves lit to guard their sins." I finished my brandy in silence, feeling a deep weariness settle over me. Outside, the rain had ceased, and the mist was beginning to lift. London stirred faintly, a living organism waking from a troubled dream. Holmes, too, seemed to shake off his mood. He turned to me with that familiar twinkle of mischief returning to his grey eyes. "Well, Watson," he said briskly, "if you are quite recovered from our nautical adventures, I believe we have just received a commission from the Earl of Wickham regarding a missing emerald tiara. A far more civilized affair. No mud, no mildew, and I trust considerably less danger of being pushed into the Thames." I laughed, rising to fetch my coat. "As ever, Holmes, I am at your service." And so, as one case closed, another beckoned. The phantom light of Wren's Wharf had been extinguished at last, but the eternal game of shadows and pursuit, the dance of cunning and deduction, was far from over. Not while Sherlock Holmes walked the streets of London. Chapter 12. The Last Reflection. The final unravelling of the affair came, fittingly, not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, smoky confines of Baker Street, where so many mysteries had met their end. A week had passed since Elias Norton, alias Redgate, had been charged and taken into custody. Lestrade visited twice in those days, once to deliver an official note of thanks from the Commissioner himself, a rarity Holmes received with a dry lift of his brow, and once more to inform us that Norton, despite a formidable legal defence, had broken under the mounting evidence. He had confessed to orchestrating the entire deception, the resurrection of Wren's Wharf as a secret archive, the silent blackmail of shipping barons and minor politicians, the use of the phantom light as a signal to move stolen documents through the river tunnels. When Selby, once an eager accomplice, grew fearful and sought to sell his story to the authorities, Norton had ordered his death with a chilling detachment. "But," Lestrade admitted with a grunt as he sipped tea opposite us, "there's one part Norton wouldn't explain." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "The crate." Lestrade nodded. "He never said how he learned about it, never said why he guarded it so fiercely." Holmes smiled slightly. "Because he did not know what it contained, not precisely. He only knew that Lord Orford, before his untimely death, had paid a small fortune to have it smuggled past customs. Norton reasoned, correctly, that anything deemed worth such lengths must hold great value. And when he salvaged the ledgers, after the fire, piecing together fragments of the conspiracy, he saw in it that create the crown jewel of his ambitions." Lestrade shook his head. "And it turned out to be dusty papers." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Papers, Lestrade, which represented a kind of wealth few understand. The power to command fleets, ruin fortunes, sway governments. Norton was no common thief. He dreamt of an empire built not on gold, but on fear." Lestrade finished his tea with a grimace. "And now he'll have a cell to rule over." After the inspector left, the house grew still once more. Holmes returned to his chair, a rare weariness settling over him. He, too, felt the final weight of the case descend. I pulled a chair closer to the fire and ventured, "Was there ever any true mystery, Holmes, behind the phantom light itself?" Holmes tapped his pipe thoughtfully against the arm of his chair. "The true mystery, Watson, was never the light," he said. "The lamp was merely the visible tip of a submerged world, an unseen war waged in dusty ledgers and forgotten crates. Mortlake, Lytton, Selby, Norton, they were all caught by the same current: fear of discovery, hunger for power, dread of exposure." He paused, studying the flames. "In the end, it was not the police who defeated Norton, nor even me. It was the oldest force of all, the greed that blinds and the fear that betrays." Outside, London stirred into life once more. The bells of St. Mary's tolled the hour, their sound muffled by the mist, but steady as ever. A reminder that though empires might rise and conspiracies fall, time, like the river, flowed inexorably onward. Holmes stirred from his reverie with a small smile. "Come, Watson, enough of dead men and broken dreams. Let us see what living puzzles await us in the morning edition." He reached for the newspaper, and I, smiling despite myself, leaned forward to join him. The phantom light of Wren's Wharf had burned its last, leaving only the smoke of memory and the silent satisfaction of truth restored. And as long as Sherlock Holmes remained in the world, there would always be another shadow to chase, another secret to uncover, and always, always another light in the fog.